How has the Kingdom of Jordan survived a century of its monarchs trying to play both ends against the middle? It's an American ally and at peace with Israel and cooperates closely with both on security issues. Yet in public, it is a strident foe of the Jewish state, critical of the United States, and an apologist for the Palestinian cause. In private, it knows it can't survive without American and Israeli help, and that a government led by its half-British and American-educated king must strive not to offend the majority of its population, that is Palestinian Arab, lest it fall prey to Islamist forces that seek to subvert it. Today, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the question of whether King Abdullah and his Hashemite regime can go on preserving a cold peace with Israel with Aaron Magid, author of the new book, The Most American King, Abdullah of Jordan. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with author and journalist Aaron Magid, discussing his new book about King Abdullah of Jordan. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast, where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. If the preservation of Jordan as a moderate Arab state not aligned with Iran and willing to cooperate with the United States and Israel on security issues is in the interests of both of those nations, how much does it matter that Jordan's monarch and his wife often say and do things to offend Americans and Israelis? The answer from those in the know about the relationship with Amman is that we shouldn't be distracted from the vital role the Desert Kingdom plays as a buffer against Iran and Islamist terror groups that hate America, as well as wishing to destroy the Jewish state and topple King Abdullah. The king has spent the last 27 years since he succeeded his father, King Hussein, trying to balance the need to mollify the majority of his subjects who call themselves Palestinians, while still staying close to the United States and Israel, without whose assistance his regime would certainly fall. How does Abdullah manage to hang on in Jordan, and how viable is his regime in the long run? More to the point, can it long survive as a half-Palestinian nation whose people hate Israel, but whose government relies on the Jewish state to stay in power? To discuss all this, we're pleased to have with us today a journalist who spent years in Jordan and who has now written a new biography of the king. Aaron Magid is former Amman-based journalist. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, AL Monitor, The Atlantic Council, France 24, Al Jazeera, and the Middle East Institute. He hosts the podcast On Jordan, and he is the author of the new book, The Most American King, Abdullah of Jordan. Aaron Magid, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Aaron, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking, who exactly is King Abdullah, the book you're dubbed as the most American king? How does he differ from his father, King Hussein, and how has that affected Jordan's relationships with Israel and the United States?
Sure. So you asked a few great questions. In terms of who King Abdullah is, he came into power in 1999 and has been Jordan's king ever since. He's actually now the longest serving Arab leader in the entire region. So many of his counterparts, whether Saddam Hussein, Yasser Arafat, Bashar al-Assad, who were in power at the early period that he started, were ousted or died. So he really has a lot of longevity. In terms of why I chose the title The Most American King, it really speaks to his unique, both personal and political relationship with the United States. So personally, he went to middle school and high school in Massachusetts. He went to Deerfield Academy. He was on the wrestling team. And he went by Ab, not Abdullah, because he wanted to fit in with other guys. In fact, when his dad wanted him to take Arabic lessons, he would occasionally hide in the closet because he just wanted a more traditional American experience. Afterwards,
can I ask about that? You mentioned this at various times in the book. he's clearly, his mother was English. He also went to Sandhurst, the British version of West Point. Um, is he really more comfortable in English than in Arabic?
So when he came into power in 1999, he definitely spoke better English than Arabic, especially just because he'd spent so much time in the West. As I mentioned, middle school and high school, then in the military. Afterwards, he studied at Georgetown University. He so much enjoyed that experience. He sent his own children to the prestigious Jesuit college. He trained with U.S. military in Kentucky. He was actually on a Star Trek episode in California before he became king. His honeymoon wasn't in Petra or Wadi
Has that
Rum.
in common with Stacey Abrams, the would-be governor of Georgia? Yeah.
His honeymoon was not in Wadi Rum or Petra, but it was actually in Hawaii, New York, and Washington. And as you noted, he spoke English far better than Arabic just because of the amount of time he spent in the West. Even after he became king, he continued to own properties in the United States, both in the California area and in the Washington, D.C. region. Now, if we were to think about this in an American perspective, we had an American leader who spent middle school and high school in Mexico, spoke better Spanish than English, went to a university in Mexico, trained with the Mexican military. It would be a huge campaign story, if not, the main one, especially in the MAGA era.
But kings of Jordan don't get elected, do they?
Correct. So they have that benefit. But it's not just a personal relationship, it's also the political one. So King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to meet in the White House with President Trump, President Biden, and President Obama. Thousands of U.S. troops are stationed in Jordan under King Abdullah's reign, under both Democratic and Republican administrations. King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to have a joint address before Congress. This was during the Bush administration. Also during the Bush administration, he was the first Arab leader to have a joint free trade agreement with the United States. So time and time again, under King Abdullah's rule, they've really strengthened the relationship with the U.S. And that is one of the reasons I argue that he stayed in power for so long.
Before we jump in, a quick invitation. The 2026 JNS International Policy Summit is coming up this April. It will be held from April 15th through the 17th, once again at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem. I'll be there, and I'll hope you'll join us too. You can visit jns-summit.org to register and see the speaker lineup. It's an exceptional group and well worth your time. I'll look forward to meeting you in Jerusalem this April. That leads me to my question when we were talking about how odd it is to have, a leader of that country who is so at home in other places and still has homes in other places. So the question is, how popular is Abdullah in Jordan and in an undemocratic country? Well, what role does public opinion, both those who regard themselves as Palestinians and those who see themselves, as you refer to them in the book, as East Bankers, a term that references the period from 1949 to 1967 when Jordan illegally occupied Judea and Samaria, the term West Bank was coined. How does that play in the country's policies?
So it's a great question in terms of how popular he is, and nobody can definitively answer that just because the polling on that issue is prohibited in the country. You can't do polling and say, whether you like King Abdullah's policies on the economy or foreign policy or just in general favorability at all. Think about how often those polls are in the United States about President Biden or President Trump. So in King Abdullah's case, we don't know. We can get anecdotal evidence, but anecdotal evidence isn't really scientific. In terms of the anecdotal evidence, people speak of King Hussein a bit more positively overall than King Abdullah, though that's unclear if that's just kind of looking back at the past in a really favorable light versus the challenges that existed at that time under King Hussein, because he also faced severe ones. But he is lucky that he doesn't face elections because there are serious challenges to his rule. I would say that the biggest one is the economy. The unemployment rate is over 20%, and it's been like that for years now. Just to put in perspective, in the United States, some people are unhappy with the economy, and the unemployment rate is about 4.5%. So it's about 5 times as worse in Jordan, and it's been going on for many, many years. To give you one anecdote, during the Biden administration, you had Jordanians fly to Mexico to try to illegally migrate into the United States just to find jobs because the financial situation in the Hashemite Kingdom was so poor. Of course, under the Trump administration, that's no longer feasible. But it just really speaks to the very difficult economic conditions. And when you ask Jordanians repeatedly in polls, what's the number one focus, even though in the Western press it's a lot about the Palestinian issue or Syria or Iraq, for Jordanians it's consistently the economy. And King Abdullah has really failed in that regards.
I guess the question is, though, obviously he doesn't have to worry about re-election, but he does worry about public opinion. And how does he navigate that? And how repressive is Jordan as a country? I mean, of course, it's always compared to what? Compared to, Assad, Syria, Jordan may have been a paradise, but, compared to, Israel, a different story.
So as you note, it's all about how you compare it. Certainly, the condition, whether for journalists or protesters, is far better in Jordan than it is Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Syria under Bashar al-Assad, or even Egypt under the current administration. So it is better than many other countries in the Arab world, but it's far worse than other democracies, certainly in Western Europe or around the world. So it's kind of I would say, low medium. Freedom House has put Jordan in the partly free category. The Economist has a ranking of democracies and puts Jordan in the lowest one as authoritarian. The Freedom House ranking did give the Jordanian government credit for a recent election that they had in allowing the Islamic Action Front to win the largest number of seats, which is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. But then right after that election, the Muslim Brotherhood was banned. So one kind of wonders what the purpose of having elections is if then right afterwards the party is banned that does the best. So I don't expect Freedom House to continue to put Jordan in the partly free category. They usually were in the not free category, so I would assume that they would be in that element as well. But as you note, it's all about comparison. Jordan is better than the worst, but it's not in a good spot at all.
Yeah, it has, as you say, it has elections, but the parliament doesn't really govern. The cabinet, the prime minister, they're all still appointed by the king, right?
Correct. The king is the one firing and dismissing the prime ministers. Even the prime ministers in the country, it's a very weak position. In fact, during the Arab Spring protests in 2011, 2012, the King Abdullah repeatedly fired prime ministers every few months to allow the people to think, we're changing, we're listening to the voice of the people, even though everyone knew that he and the intelligence services are the ones calling the shot.
How did he evade? Obviously there was a lot of unrest in various countries in the region, in various Arab countries in the region. Egypt goes through, the Mubarak government is overthrown, and then the Muslim Brotherhood government that replaces it, is toppled by the military, which is still in power. Obviously, Syria, there's a civil war which goes on forever, and millions of people, flee, and hundreds of thousands die, and now it's hard to define exactly what it is. But Jordan, the king still sits on his throne. How did he manage that?
So I would say the United States played a key factor in that, if you especially compare Jordan to Egypt. Barack Obama at the time called on Hosni Mubarak to resign, and that played a key role in allowing the military to take over control over that country. In Jordan, even though, as you mentioned, there were protests in the country, people were unhappy, not just about the economy, but also about corruption and just about authoritarianism in general. But President Obama, because of his longstanding relationship with King Abdullah, along with the U.S. government in general, whether in the military or in the CIA, they decided not to have that similar public call for King Abdullah to resign. If he would have made that call, it would have put him in an extremely challenging position. So the United States role was critical. I would also say that King Abdullah has really strong support within Jordan's security establishment. He served in the military for over 15 years before he became king. He was actually the head of the special unit division of Jordan's military. So they have been very loyal to him during difficult moments, whether the Arab Spring protests, the Prince Hamza sedition affair in 2021, or even during the Gaza protests in 2003 and 2024. So he's relied on the security establishment, which is generally made up of more Jordanians of East Bank or tribal background and less Palestinian ones. It's a lesson that King Abdullah learned from his father's experience during Black September in 1970, when there was a civil war, thousands were killed. And in fact, some of the members of Jordan's military actually defected to the Palestinian side. So King Abdullah learned that lesson and ensured that the senior members of his military and security establishment are generally made of East Bankers.
Yeah, so they're loyal to the Hashemite regime.
Correct.
You briefly referred to, the Prince Hamza treason trouble. It's not quite the Hashemite royal family is not quite as large or as rich as the Saudi royal family, but he's faced some trouble from some of his relatives, his uncle and others. He supplanted his uncle as crown prince. How close is that family, and how has that played out?
So they're certainly not as wealthy as the Saudi royal family. King Abdullah and Queen Rania do have a relatively sizable amount of money. There have been various leaks in the past few years that show, extremely wealthy homes, not only in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, hundreds of millions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts. So they're definitely not poor.
What is it? Well, we know where the Saudis got their money because they're sitting on a lot of oil. Where does the royal family of Jordan get their money?
So that's a challenging question. Of course, we're not going to have an official answer to that. The Jordanian government would say that King Abdullah inherited money from his father, and there was nothing nefarious, and he just invested it well, and his money has blossomed. And they would say that compared to other rulers in the region, he certainly doesn't have the most money or even anywhere close. Some Jordanian activists would say that there's been some corruption involved, but they often don't have significant proof for that. Of course, Jordan's generally not a transparent society in general when dealing with the royal court or sensitive economic agreements. During the early 2000s, one of the ways that King Abdullah really changed the policies from his father is his father was basically a state-run economy. In Jordan, under King Abdullah's rule, during the beginning, he liberalized the economy, sold off a lot of these state-owned enterprises. Some activists have accused the Jordanian government during that time of corruption, of kind of using that money not for the people, but for themselves. But unfortunately, there isn't really much proof in either direction.
Yeah, that was true in Israel, where the government, there was sort of the old socialist model was still in effect, and then in the 1990s and 2000s, Israel's economy was opened up and it became a more free market economy, and it just thrived. Obviously, Abdullah wanted to do the same thing, but it didn't work there, did it?
So he did have temporary success. So he came into power. Unemployment was also in a really bad situation. It was about 25% in 1999, and he got it down to 12 to 13% in 2008. And he got a lot of credit by the IMF and the World Bank for his liberalization program and lowering the national debt, lowering the unemployment rate. But unfortunately, after 2008, in the worldwide recession, Jordan's economy really got hit off track. And then just a series of crises, whether it was the Syrian refugee crisis in 2011, the Arab Spring protests, you had a gas crisis with Egypt, there were ISIS attacks, and that put Jordan in a very difficult position. Then you had ISIS and the impact of that and the decline in tourism. And then you had COVID. And so the unemployment rate just went up and up and up. And now it's over 20%. And it's been like that since for quite a few years right now. And King Abdullah really doesn't have a great solution to that.
What is the basis of Jordan's economy? What are their major industries?
So tourism is a significant industry for them. They have a textile industry. They have some sort of finance industry, but none of these are huge moneymakers. They don't really have much of a high-tech sector. Some Jordanian economists complain about red tape. And a lot of Jordanians, when they want to make money, they actually go to the Gulf region, whether to the UAE or to Saudi Arabia, to be more successful. But Jordan's economy is really one of his weakest elements of king. I would say his strengths are providing security and stability to his country, especially considering almost every country surrounding Jordan has dealt with massive wars, refugee crisis, whether Iraq, Syria, the Palestinian situation, on and on and on. But King Abdullah has provided security and quiet for his country, where it's not just that refugees don't leave this country, but they're actually actively coming into Jordan, whether after the 2003 Iraq war or the 2011 Syrian conflict, or the Palestinians before that, because Jordan is a bastion of stability.
Now, you write in your book about Abdullah's attempt to promote a Jordan-first approach to public policy in general, which I guess was a stretch in a country where politics is heavily influenced by what happens on the other side of the Jordan River. In that context, what is Jordanian nationality or nationalism? Is there such a thing in a country where so many identify as Palestinian?
Well, so King Abdullah's Jordan First policy was a response to that situation where many in Jordan were prioritizing pan-Arab issues, and this came about before the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. So for many Jordanians, including his father, King Hussein, they really parked their entire identity with the pan-Arab cause. So King Hussein, before the 1991 war, strongly opposed the U.S. invasion. It led to a reduction pretty significantly of U.S. aid to Jordan. Jordan's very reliant on U.S. aid. So that was really a disaster for the country. And King Abdullah, in response to that, he knew the 2003 war was approaching. He didn't agree with the war. It wasn't his favorite idea, but he understood that he can't do the same policy as King Hussein. He needed to really prioritize his own country's needs. So what did that mean? It meant prioritizing really, and more in a soft way, his relationship with the United States. So it meant overflight rights for U.S. Military aircraft from Jordan into Iraq, intelligence gathering missions from Jordan into Iraq. There were U.S. troops stationed in the country as well. So he allowed for the U.S. to work with Jordan quietly in order to preserve that relationship. So that was on the Iraq front. On the Palestinian front, as you mentioned, that Jordan has the largest number in terms of percentages of Palestinians outside of the West Bank and Gaza. It's about 50%. This, like the issue with King Abdullah's popularity, there's no official number because it's such a sensitive issue. So we don't know. It could actually be significantly higher than 50% of Palestinian origin. But regardless, so many Jordanians at that time, this was during the Second Intifada. Of course, many Palestinians were killed along with Israelis at the time. But for Jordanians, they wanted to cut off the peace treaty with Israel and the security cooperation. But King Abdullah said, whoa, we got to hold on. We need to prioritize our own national interests. Our own national interest is not to do that, because then, of course, he would lose out on significant U.S. aid, and it could cause security challenges with his country, with Israel. So he consistently has tried to prioritize a Jordan First policy. And this is over 15 years or 10 to 15 years before President Trump used that slogan with the United States. So it was actually kind of prophetic almost for him to use it. But the Jordan First policy has been trying to prioritize his country's national interests over pan-Arab causes.
One of the open secrets about the Middle East, and one that basically everybody knows, and which you acknowledge in your book, is that Jordan's security services are deeply connected to those of the United States and Israel. Not to put too fine a point on it, could Abdullah and his family survive without the help and ultimately the guarantee of assistance from Washington and Jerusalem?
It's a good question, and one that you can't definitively prove either way. But it's without a doubt he's benefited in a very dramatic way, especially from the partnership with the United States. It's not just a training that they get. I spoke with a Jordanian intelligence officer, and he said, he was in Langley multiple times in Virginia at CIA headquarters getting training from the U.S. intel, and he's speaking with this on the record because the cooperation is really so strong. Now, one example of the cooperation between the Jordanian intelligence and the CIA was after 9/11, the United States was transferring to Jordan non-Jordanian detainees for interrogations because they could be interrogated more freely than
that was one of the so-called black sites, right?
In the black site. And then after they were there for a while, according to Human Rights Watch, they were transferred to Guantanamo Bay. So the connection is really, really tight on the security level. Jordan receives billions of dollars in annual aid from the United States, and that's not only budgetary support, but its advanced weaponry is key. So I do think one of the reasons King Abdullah has stayed in power for so long is his support from the West and the United States. But I would say it's not just that. If he didn't have the backing from the security forces, I don't think he would maintain power for this long. And I think there are a few other elements that are also key. Number one is he didn't adopt the Assad approach to opposition. If he would have started bombing his people, flattening hospitals like you saw in Syria, or what Saddam Hussein did to his own people in Iraq, that would have really galvanized the opposition against him, and that would have led to long-term instability. King Abdullah is certainly no Democrat. he's the one in power, but at the same time, he understands that he doesn't want to go overboard because that would really increase the opposition against him. And then finally, in terms of his Jordan First policy, he's been very cautious about using military force. And this is in contrast really to his father. His father not only participated in the 1967 war against Israel, and of course he lost the East Bank, the West Bank and East Jerusalem during that conflict, but then they also had a conflict with Syria a few years later. King Abdullah, and you see this in the current dynamics with Gaza, he was very clear he was not willing to send Jordanian troops to Gaza because he knew that wasn't in his country's interests. If he were to do that, if Jordanian soldiers would be killed by Hamas militants, it would just be very unpopular. And if Jordanian soldiers killed, Hamas officials in tunnels, it would also be deeply unpopular in the country. So he's been cautious in his usage of military force, and that has reduced the need for other countries in the region to try to attack Jordan. And if you think of some of the other countries in the region who face downfall or just significant instability, whether Iraq or Libya, a lot of that is because of military antagonism elsewhere in the region. So I would think those all factors are key in maintaining his rule, but without a doubt, the United States support, along with other partners, has been extremely important.
Abdullah has, I think his great-grandfather was assassinated, or was it his great-great-grandfather, his namesake Abdullah, and he's faced numerous attempts on his life too, hasn't he?
Correct. So in the beginning of his rule, he faced an assassination attempt by al-Qaeda, but of course, it was a failed assassination attempt. ISIS has consistently criticized him, though I don't think they've ever had the capabilities to really carry out a successful attack because of the quality of Jordan's security forces. So he has faced some challenges, but I would say nothing has been, extremely urgent one. Especially during the Gaza war, there were a lot of articles and analysts who were saying whether the protests in Gaza are going to lead to the downfall of the regime. I always think that those people should be very careful before predicting the downfall of King Abdullah, just because he's gone through a lot of challenges, whether the Arab Spring protests, the Syrian refugee crisis, ISIS, and he always is able to survive. Maybe the country isn't thriving from an economic perspective, but he can survive. And if you have a challenge like protests in Gaza, the country has dealt with protests. They know how to manage it, and King Abdullah did that pretty successfully.
Now, Jordan, you alluded to this. Jordan does get $1.45 billion with a B, from the United States every year. There are some who claim it is sort of basically a bribe to keep the 1994 peace treaty with Israel. But does the United States get anything from this relationship? Has Jordan assisted U.S. operations, for example, against Iran? Would it do it again?
So Jordan has been a very loyal partner to the United States, and it's far beyond just keeping the peace treaty. If you look from 2023 to 2025 during the Gaza war, on 3 separate occasions, Jordan's military shot down Iranian missiles and drones that were fired from Iran over Hashemite Kingdom's airspace to Israel. It saved, countless Israeli lives. And it was extremely important that they did it. And it's not only that they shot down these weapons, that they also allowed U.S. troops to be deployed in the country to also use the advanced American aircraft to shoot them down. So Jordan has time and time again been a very loyal partner to the United States. Another example would be after the 2011 Syrian war erupted, hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees came into the country and stayed there. And of course, it was not in the U.S. interest or European interest for these refugees to go to the West, but they stayed in Jordan, which helped, certainly from a U.S. national security interests, have these refugees not in our country. So time and time again—
How many are still there?
So it depends on the number. According to the UN, there were about 650,000 refugees during the peak, and now it's about 500,000. According to Jordanian government, it was at 1.3 million, so it subtracts similarly. But there are, even though the war has ended, a very significant number of Syrian refugees, hundreds of thousands have still remained in Jordan because either they don't want to return to Syria because of the economy, or they fear their security, or they just become very comfortable in the country. But Jordan has consistently opened up its doors to the Syrian population.
Now, we've touched on this before, but how stable is his regime? And what are the main threats to the Hashemite monarchy? Is it the Palestinians? Iran, Sunni extremists like those in al-Qaeda-like groups that now appear to have the upper hand in Syria, or the Hashemites' old enemies from a century ago, the Saudis, whose forebears kicked Abdullah's family out of the Arabian Peninsula that was not yet called Saudi. They've had trouble with them too, haven't they?
So I would say the biggest challenge to the Hashemite kingdom is not any external country or any external threat, whether they do have challenges, whether with ISIS, whether they've had disagreements, as you mentioned, with Syria over the years, or even Iraq. But today, I would say the biggest one is internally, and it's mainly the economy. Just because you have such a high number of youth without any jobs, without any future, people just living with their parents indefinitely, or just people who graduate school, university and then end up taxi drivers. So it's not something that we're going to see as a security challenge tomorrow or next month. But it could be a difficulty long term, and especially down the road. And I would say a very sensitive point that we should be keeping our eye out for is the transition from King Abdullah to Crown Prince Hussein. In general,
who is his son?
Who is his eldest son,
Right.
who also attended Georgetown University, also trained in the UK military. So he kind of repeated a lot of steps of his father, is currently serving at least part-time in the Jordanian military. But as we saw with Egypt, when they were talking about transferring power from Mubarak to his son, people often get upset at that moment. And Crown Prince Hussein, he has been meeting with various officials. You see him joining with his father on visits even to Washington to meet with President Trump or President Biden, but he hasn't really had to solve any problems on his own. And if King Abdullah were to, either because of illness, he's actually at the similar age of his father when he passed away, though I think he's probably in better health. But if something were to happen and King and Crown Prince Hussein were suddenly thrust into the scene, and he faced some challenges, that could be a difficult moment for the regime. But I don't think, tomorrow or next month, King Abdullah is going to face any significant security dilemmas.
Are there any family members that, could pose a threat? I mean, that was, he edged out his uncle to succeed his father, and there have been other sort of rumblings and a treason trial. How is that? What is the tension within, his own family?
So I would say the most significant family threat would be the former crown prince, Hamza, who's actually under house arrest right now. Is widely popular among Jordanians because he speaks Arabic in a similar way to his father. He has a look that's also similar to King Hussein, and King Hussein is widely adored in the country. So he's under house arrest, so there's no situation where tomorrow or next month he's going to take over. But if he were somehow released by that, and there were, once again, these are kind of issues that are difficult to imagine, but if there were elections or there's some way that the people could choose, I think the crown prince would have a challenge in that moment. So I would say he's the number one threat. Queen Noor, who is King Hussein's last wife, she's also been at various times very outspoken in favor of her son, the former Crown Prince Hamza. So she's also someone to keep an eye out for. But I don't think there would be any situation where Queen Noor would take over the country. It's just in terms of her relationship with her son.
She was American, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and so interesting. Let's talk a bit more about the vocal public support that Abdullah and his Palestinian, queen, his wife, give to the Palestinian cause. They may still advocate for something that is obviously not going to happen anytime in the foreseeable future, namely a Palestinian Arab state, other than the one that has been run in Gaza by Hamas. But wouldn't a Palestinian state actually be, a theoretical Palestinian state, be a threat to them as well?
So as you mentioned, in terms of Jordan's foreign policy, I would say the number one issue is their support of a two-state solution, a Palestinian state, even if, as I do agree with you, that's certainly not something that's going to happen anytime soon. But consistently, when King Abdullah meets with foreign leaders, it's not just in the Middle East, but even when he's meeting with people who are extremely far away, like Kazakhstan or in Africa, he's always mentioning that topic as number one. It's unclear whether it's number one because that's the most important issue that he believes in personally, or it's because he thinks that that's what his population wants. And as we noted, about 50% of the country is of Palestinian origin. And it might be a bit of both. But consistently, the Palestinian cause and a two-state solution is very important. But I would mention, many of the citizens are not pleased with the two-state solution because they would want, like a one-state solution of Hamas or just like, Palestinian statehood without Israel. And he doesn't adopt that path. So even though there were times, especially during the Gaza war, there was certain frustration within the Israeli government over stances that King Abdullah
his wife was denying the atrocities of October 7th on American TV.
So as you mentioned, there was a lot of discontent with the royal family. King Abdullah did use the word "quote unquote" genocide for what happened in Gaza. So the Israeli government certainly didn't appreciate that. As you mentioned, there were comments the Queen Rania made on CNN. Jordan did pull its ambassador from Tel Aviv during the beginning of the conflict and said he wouldn't return until the war ended, but the war has actually ended and the ambassador still is not there. They told the ambassador in Amman also to not return until the war ended, but the war has ended and there's no ambassador. There's a water for energy deal that was frozen and there's really no update about that. So Jordan did take certain steps against Israel during the war that the Israeli government didn't appreciate, partially due to its Palestinian population, but also I would think because King Abdullah genuinely did believe this. But I would say at the same time, there were many Jordanian activists who wanted the Jordanian government to do far more against Israel, and King Abdullah consistently refused that. So one example would be...
The peace treaty, he has no intention of doing anything to the peace treaty, let alone the security cooperation, which obviously is a life and death issue for his regime.
Correct. So the peace treaty was the number one issue that the activists wanted, and there were huge demonstrations in Amman and elsewhere in the country. Tens of thousands of people going out calling for the peace treaty to be canceled, and he refused to do it. There was also the $15 billion with the B gas accord that was signed between Israel and Jordan in the mid-2010s. This was during the Obama administration, and King Abdullah also has not done that. And then most significantly, as we discussed, 3 times Jordan shot down Iranian missiles and drones. This saved a huge amount of Israeli lives. If Jordan refused to do it and refused to allow U.S. troops to operate from their soil to shoot them down, it would have put Israel in a very, very difficult dilemma. And he did get some flack from his population. They were saying, why are you getting involved in this conflict? You can just do nothing, and these missiles aren't really going to hit us. But he did take that very significant stand. I would say the main reason wasn't to help Prime Minister Netanyahu, is probably to shore up his ties with the United States. The argument that he made before his people is he's protecting his country's sovereignty, and he can't allow various countries to use their airspace for nefarious purposes. But whatever the reason was, the result from an Israeli perspective was extremely beneficial. So I would think from the Israeli government or the Israeli population's viewpoint, whether they would prefer to have dozens or hundreds of lives saved versus some diplomatic criticism, they would have preferred that option.
Yeah, well, the security cooperation works for both sides, for sure. Speaking of the tension with the Palestinian population in Jordan, I really can't do a show about Jordan without raising the issue of Alam Tamimi, who was the Palestinian terrorist whom Abdullah's government has refused to extradite to the United States to face charges of murdering American citizens. That refusal is defended as a matter of an existential threat to Abdullah's regime and that he would be put in danger if he defied Palestinian public opinion. Do you think that's true?
I don't think it would be a huge threat to his survival. There would certainly be people who would be upset if they were to transfer it. But I would say the United States has not prioritized that issue. In terms of when President Trump, President Biden, going all the way back to President Obama, that's not their number 1, number 2, number 3. If it might be number 27 priority of the United States. If it were really the number 1 or number 2 priority of the United States, given how much the U.S. provides to Jordan financially and militarily, she would be extradited, but it's not.
Yeah, well, that's probably quite true. I guess to drill down on the conflict with Israel, what was the reaction to October 7th and the horrors of that day in Jordan? As I said, the Queen actually denied the Hamas atrocities. Given that and Palestinian intransigence, is it possible for Jordan to go on indefinitely navigating between its dependence on America and Israel and the fact that its people simply don't want the peace to continue?
So there was polling in Jordan about the October 7th attack, and there was approximately 2/3 of the population supported it. So just for your listeners to understand, the Jordanian public is extremely hawkish, pro-Palestinian on this issue. King Abdullah did condemn the October 7th attacks. But it's also important for people to keep in perspective. If King Abdullah were to not be in power, there's no AIPAC alternative. The alternative is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood won the most seats in the 2024 election, and there was a lot of pressure against them in gerrymandering. So it probably even wasn't a free and fair election, but they still won the most seats. So if King Abdullah were to not be in power, and you can see 2/3 of the population is supporting October 7th attacks, it puts in a really dire strait the future of a Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty. So that's kind of the reality that we have in Jordan. And that's why the Israeli security establishment has consistently supported King Abdullah's rule, because they know the alternatives would be very terrible from their perspectives.
Yeah, it's kind of like the same situation with Egypt, where, again, you say there's the only alternative to the current regime, which is even more brutal than, the Abdullah, monarchy and the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan. There's the only alternative to them is the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's obviously, General Sisi is preferable, just as King Abdullah is preferable.
Correct. Consistently in elections, the Muslim Brotherhood does very well. They're the most organized opposition party. You have to remember the Jordanian population is very religious, so they sympathize with the Muslim Brotherhood, not just in terms of the Palestinian issue, but the Muslim Brotherhood philosophy in general is very anti-United States. They've consistently criticized the U.S. Jordanian security agreements between the countries. So if King Abdullah were in power, it would be a really bad situation also for U.S. Jordanian ties.
Yeah. So, I guess that's just basically the dilemma. What was it like working as a reporter, as an American, as well as someone who is Jewish, in Amman for a few years?
So I definitely benefited as an American. I wrote articles that were criticizing not only the Jordanian government, but I've also criticized let me clarify. I've criticized and praised the royal family, but unfortunately, in authoritarian societies, if they hear any criticism, they automatically view that as someone who's totally against.
Well, actually, American politicians are kind of like that too. But
maybe, but
they just can't do the same things to you that dictatorial regimes.
Correct, but just to give you an example, the book is not allowed to be sold in Jordan. There's no bookstores that are selling this book. It's not because there's 7 other biographies about King Abdullah, but no, they don't want any nuanced perspective on the leader.
And it's not really all that critical. You're not deeply, you're pretty straightforward about him.
Correct, but anything that doesn't completely praise their side is viewed as heretical. So going back to being an American.
So by writing this, I guess before, I'd like to hear more about, sort of what your life was like there, but by writing this, have you kind of burned your bridges there?
It's a good question. So I continue writing about the country and various. I actually had an article in the response and today about Jordan, but I wouldn't go to the Hashemite Kingdom by myself right now, just because I would be concerned about my security. I do feel eventually I can return. I've been there many times. I used to live there, as I mentioned, but I would only go back if I were part of an organization connected to the United States. I don't think there's not be a situation where Jordan would detain me, indefinitely, not because I'm of importance, just because I'm an American citizen, and that would just do really bad PR to the country. And then Congress would get involved, and then people are saying, why are we going to give them $1.5 billion if they're a U.S. citizen? So I think the fact that I was American gave me a lot of privileges that a Jordanian or an Arab journalist didn't have in the country, because they couldn't write about some of these sensitive issues because they would end up in jail and they don't have the American passport to get you out. Because I had the American passport, I did run into problems with the Jordanian government. They stopped answering emails, no interviews. They would prevent me from going to Syrian refugee camps by the end. So, it made it very difficult to write stories. But I never had to fear I was going to be jailed for weeks or months or tortured. That just can't happen in the country because of the importance of the U.S.-Jordan security relationship.
Well, obviously, American Jews do visit Jordan, largely to go to Petra, but there are no Jews in Jordan.
Correct. It's a very different situation than you have like in Egypt or Iraq or Morocco, where you had Jewish communities of hundreds or even over 1,000 years that were thriving, and then because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they were forced to flee or whatever. In Jordan, because there were very few people living in the country before 1948 at all, So it was mainly desert. And so there was no organic Jewish community. So it's not like people have fled the country. They just were never there at all. So in terms of the Jewish population, it is very small in the country. It would mainly consist of people working, whether at the U.S. Embassy, you have some American students who are studying Arabic, maybe some working in an NGO, but there's no Jewish institutions at all in the country. There's no synagogue, there's no Jewish community center, anything like that. And there is a significant amount of anti-Semitism in the country. To give you one example, is individuals who cross from Israel into Jordan, especially in the land crossings, and they have Jewish ritual objects. Often the Jordanian security establishment will seize them and not allow you to bring them into the country. So, of course, they don't do that with other religions, but they do that with Judaism. Another example would be Mein Kampf is widely sold in Arabic in downtown Amman, like on the street, all over the place. And it's not like, oh, this is a terrible book. But this is like interesting material. So there is certainly anti-Semitism in the country. A lot of Jordanians, conflate, their opposition to the Israeli military with American Jews all together as one bad combination.
What about in the media and sort of culture? How does that play out there, the anti-Semitism?
There's significant amount. I'm not sure it's worse than other Arab countries, but in terms of compared to when people complain about anti-Semitism in the United States, if you spent time in Jordan or an Arab country, it's 1,000 times worse.
That is undoubtedly true. Well, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us today. That we learned a lot about Abdullah and about Jordan. How can our audience find out more about your writing and your book and follow your work?
Sure. So I would say number one, in terms of the book, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on my publisher's website, Universal Publishers. You can also get an ebook, Kindle, etc., wherever you find books. You just Google The Most American King, Abdullah of Jordan. If you want to follow me on social media, Twitter, at Aaron Magid, LinkedIn, Aaron Magid as well. Those are kind of the main areas where I post my writing and analysis on Jordanian politics.
Okay, well, thank you. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which you can hear wherever you get your podcasts. And whether you're listening to us on one of them or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.